And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Michael Watkins. Michael is the co-founder of a group called Genesis Advisors. He spent 2 decades working with leaders, both corporate and public, as they transition to new roles, negotiate the future of their organizations, and craft their legacies as leaders. He's an expert in his field, and he's the author of the international bestseller, The First 90 Days, which is a phenomenal book. I must have bought 20 of those over the years to give to friends and colleagues. He's also professor of leadership and organizational change management at IMD Business School in Switzerland, and he was on the faculty of INSEAD and this other place called Harvard you may have heard of, and that's where he earned his PhD. So welcome aboard, Michael. How are you?
Really good, and delighted to be able to spend some time with you.
Great. So you've been at this game for quite some time, and you check a lot of boxes, if you will, right? So you've got a consulting firm. You're on the academic side. You're a speaker. You're an author. Tell us, if you will, sort of how those things play together in your world, where they're different and where they're connected.
Sure. So as a starting point, I describe myself, Peter, as the accidental guru, right? So I wasn't sort of going out to do this and thinking, fame and fortune awaits. I got interested in a problem. This is often how it begins, right? The problem was about leaders transitioning into new roles.
Yep.
There wasn't much out there about that. I did research. I wrote the book, right? And so the book was the starting point. And actually, The First 90 Days was the second book I wrote about transitions. The first one was called Right from the Start, and it was a good book, and it sold, 35,000 copies, but it wasn't really written for the audience. It was more an academic book. And so, the first sort of transition I made personally in this space was to really understand how to write to this audience, right? To write to a professional audience, to put it in terms that were really useful, to hit on problems that they really cared about. And that led to the writing of The First 90 Days, which then took off like a rocket ship in a way I never really expected it to.
Well, look, I want to push on
Yeah.
that though for a minute. Let me pause you for a second, if I
Go
could,
for it.
Michael. So first off, 35,000 units of a book that's more academic. That's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
Because academic is sort of code for unreadable to the normal business population, typically, right? And academics often write to academics. So the fact that your first book, you sort of said, oh, only 35,000. The average business book today is under 1,000 units. I want to touch on sort of how you made the transition, because 90 days was, I don't know how many copies it sold. It's a frighteningly large number. But how did you have to change you? Because you were an academic, and there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. But what did you have to do differently in order to articulate and communicate and get the message out in the first 90 days in a way that resonated with a more general business audience?
Yeah, it was a really important and pretty big change for me, right? So, I'd come out of a pretty traditional academic background, engineering, applied math. I was teaching at Harvard and, writing for academic audiences and hating every single moment of it. It was just like torture to me. And so, and I struggled, honestly. I really struggled with the writing. And then I sort of found a voice, right? And I kind of almost can remember when it happened, when I just started writing out of my mind and through my fingers onto the page, and it just started flowing because I was speaking to an audience that had practical concerns. And I resonated to that and wanted to communicate about it and felt passionate about it. And all of a sudden, writing became a joy. Right? And that was a huge shift for me. In parallel with that, I was up for tenure at the Harvard Business School and was writing about this stuff against the advice of my department heads and so on. But I'd concluded I wasn't going to get tenure at Harvard, so I might as well do stuff I cared about and not worry about it too much. And so I had this really funny experience of, at almost exactly the same moment, being told, okay, you're not going to get tenure at Harvard, and having, The First 90 Days published and take off like a rocket and on what was then the Business Week bestseller list for ages. And I was supposed to be in mourning because I hadn't gotten tenure,
Sure.
but I was walking around with this big smile on my face, right? And so, it's funny how these things happen sometimes, Peter, like these changes that can look on the surface like, oh, that didn't work out, or it didn't make the goal I wanted to, but it opens up a whole new set of doors.
What was the logic of your colleagues at Harvard when they sort of poo-pooed the concept in 90 days? Why were they advising? Because I'm sure their intent was well. Why were they telling you that 90 days as a concept or as a book or a construct is not going to work? What was the underlying logic?
Because I was researching and writing leadership without a license, right? I was in the negotiation and decision group. I'd done a lot of work on negotiation. I'd built a second year course about advanced negotiation and diplomacy concepts. And then I kind of took this right turn because I was just really interested in something. And so they were giving me thoughtful advice about this, but I had already concluded I wasn't going to get tenure at Harvard, and it's hard to do, right? And so I just decided to follow my passion, and that fortunately, worked out in this circumstance. And I guess that's a message, Peter, right? Which is, I think if you're going to really be a thought leader for the long run, you need to have some passion and some sense of mission and vision for what you're doing, right? You need to find that audience, you need to find that voice.
Well, I think the passion is key, but I also think, it's great to have various opinions weigh in and give you advice, but you are you have veto power over everything. So what they said to you was totally true if the objective was, I want to get tenured at Harvard, right? The advice that they gave you,
Exactly.
first off, you probably shouldn't have even asked a bunch of academics, what should I do to have a viably commercially successful business book and a career as a speaker? You wouldn't even go to them to ask that question, right? So I think it depends on what you're asking, who you're asking, and what the outcomes are. Because I would argue at some level, they were 100%.
Such a good point.
They were totally right. Probably the wrong people to ask the question at that point in time based on what your objectives were.
Yeah, well, no, so it's a great point, Peter, and you're absolutely right. I didn't ask; they offered, right? But and well-meaning,
even
right?
better.
People will give you well-meaning advice, but only you can decide, as you said, Peter, so appropriately, what direction you're going to take, what risks you're willing to take. It was a risky thing to do to go this way, right? But it paid off for me in this case.
So I want to talk about the risk because I think you called yourself an accidental guru, and I always say most folks in this space, it's accidental. I think it's less than 2 or 3% of the folks I've worked with and talked to over the many years where they made a deliberate effort to say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to be an author, speak, they had sort of the deliberate plan, and it was somewhat manufactured and business planned out and all that sort of stuff. For most, it just sort of happens. And then at some point you have to pause and say, whoa. So I want to ask you what the transition from academic, so that's, steady paycheck, nice life, good stuff, to, entrepreneur, because now you've got content that's great, but holy crap, you gotta sell it, you gotta have clients, you gotta figure out how to price it, you gotta figure out if the market values it. How do you tackle that piece of it? Because that's a whole different game.
It is a whole different game, and I think again, fortune favors the bold, right, as we say. But and fortune favors a prepared mind, right? Having some sense of plan, some sense of what you're going to try, right? And for me, one of the most important things was having an initial client that really was kind of very jazzed up about the work, right? And that client was Johnson & Johnson. I formed a partnership with them to bring the first 90 days to their leaders. I built programs for them, and I learned a tremendous amount through doing that. And so I guess that's one piece of advice I'd give, John, which is find yourself almost like a test bed, a place that you can refine your ideas, your thinking, a set of people that are on the practitioner side or the audience side that can help you kind of craft your stuff. Because for me, that paid off tremendously. By the time the first 90 days was published, I'd already had a couple of years of working with J&J with their leaders, refining the tools, refining the approach, and so on. And so when I came to write the first 90 days, it kind of just flowed out of me, and it was already sort of battle tested.
Sure.
And so I think that and I think there's a general lesson there, Peter, which is find a way to really test your stuff.
Sure.
Right. Find an anchor client, an audience, someone you can work with your stuff with to really refine it before you try to take it to market.
So I want to stay there for a minute because I think that's a critical point. There are, broadly speaking, 2 ways that people go about developing their thought leadership and their content. Number one, they dive in deep, they have a hypothesis, they research the heck out of it, they write, they research, they rewrite, they research, and then, they unfold the curtain and reveal it to the universe. And either things happen or they don't. That's one way.
Yep.
The other way is it's an ongoing iterative communication and a process and a testing of hypotheses where the book is not the greatest place in the world to test a hypothesis because it'll take you 18 months. It's 250 pages. And if you got it wrong, it's wrong. But blogging, articles. There's other ways to develop content, work, client work, like live client work. There's nothing better than live client work, even if you have to discount it a bit to get in the door.
Exactly.
So it sounds like you were more open-minded in testing the hypothesis. So by the time the book came out, you didn't know it would be the success it would, but actually this stuff works.
Exactly, right. And I think that lots of people have had that reaction to the book of, wow, this is really practical. Wow, it really works, and like, yeah, and that's good. But I think if I try to do what you just said, and actually for the first book that was modestly successful compared to the first 90 days, that's what I did, right? I went out and researched with a colleague, Dan Champa, and wrote a book that, was intended for practitioners, but had a practical, had a somewhat academic tone to it. And it did fine, right? But it was when I did the work, that deeper work of engaging with the audience, beginning to do that iterative work you're describing of refining it, seeing what works and what doesn't, until you really had something that was well thought through and worked, and you could take it to the market, and then boom, you're kind of away to the races.
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave us a review and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcast and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcasts. Could you give an example, maybe, if you recall, of a couple of things that you learned during the sort of beta phase at J&J
Sure.
that you then went back to the model or the methodology of the book, tweaked, modified it, et cetera, and said, oh, geez, if I hadn't picked up that insight, this may have had a different outcome?
Yeah, no, I can give you at least one and maybe a couple of examples, right? And I think, so very early in the work I was doing with leaders at J&J, and this was programs for leaders that had just been promoted, it became obvious that the way you take a new job depends a lot on the nature of the situation you're inheriting, right? Is it a crisis? Is it an accelerated growth scenario? Are you coming in after someone who's really successful? And that led me to create what I called the STARS model, which is startup, turnaround, accelerated growth, realignment, sustaining success, which is probably the single most thing that people remember the most about the framework, right? And so, I wouldn't have got there without that engagement.
So basically the entire model would have been missing, is what you're saying.
Yeah, no, for sure, right? And I mean, it's one of these things where, like, in retrospect, it's blindingly obvious, right? As so many things are. But it was really only through that engagement, that I saw that the ideas I had to be tailored and applied very differently depending on the situation. So there's a set of principles that are general and tools that work, but the way you apply them depends a lot on the context. Well, duh, at one level. But on the other hand, that set of interactions with those leaders really helped me refine and distill that down into something that turned out to be very, very useful.
Cool. One area I want to touch on is, because sometimes we don't see it in the moment. So now you've got the book. The book is starting to take off, and now it's a thing. At what point do you realize, like, whoa, there's a rocket ship, and what do I need to do? And maybe this is outside of my comfort zone. And oh man, people are inviting me to speak. Like, things start happening really, really fast in a short period of time.
Yes.
And I've seen people freeze and miss a lifetime opportunity. I've seen people embrace it with grace and wisdom, and I've seen people do everything in between. So how did you do that? Because you obviously did something, right?
I did. And I think the key thing is to recognize when you need a platform from which to begin to really have a larger impact. If it's just you can do a lot. You can do a lot of speaking as an individual. You don't need much of a support system to do that. But if you're really going to have a bigger impact, and especially if you're, as I wanted to, really want to take this work to client companies, you've got to decide at some point you need to build a platform, as in an organization, as in a firm, to do that, right? Now, think about me coming out of academics. I actually had some entrepreneurship in my background, and I kind of always have been a sort of intellectual entrepreneur, but I knew diddly about how to build a consulting company, right? And so it's at that point that you really need, the right people, and you need to find the right people that can help you scale, this idea, take it to market effectively, build products around it that are robust, because the other thing was, I used to do these workshops, and I do a dozen or more a year at J&J.
Yeah.
And no two would ever be the same. right? I mean, it was absolutely because I was kind of just trying things out and seeing what's happening. Oh, isn't that interesting? And wow, and I could pull it off. I could pull it off, Peter.
Sure.
But if you want to scale something, you've got to have it systematized, boiled down to its essence, able to be transferred to other people who can do it. And that's just a whole other order of business, right? To do it. And you need to find the people that can do it.
So you're preaching to the choir, totally preaching to the choir, and I want to sort of push on a couple of things that you said and unpack them a little bit. So number one, there's nothing wrong with getting paid well to go speak and do workshops and be the guy or the gal, right? That's
Absolutely
fine.
not.
There's and a lot of people, I don't say fall into that trap because that implies that it's a negative, but that's the path they take,
Yep.
right? And it's a limiting path on a couple of reasons. It's a limiting path financially. It's a limiting path relative to the impact that your work can have. And then ultimately you get bored, right? Like you don't want to do the same thing every day. And I think when you make those investments in the platform and codifying the model and the methodology so that it could stand on its own, I mean, obviously you need people to deliver it, but it's not dependent on you being in the room with your content. You change the trajectory of having a nice practice, and practices are limited by their very nature,
Yes.
to an actual business that's scalable. And you've been doing that for a long, long time. And that's, it's the heart of what we do with so many of our clients. And it's interesting to me that you saw that early on, because sometimes people don't come to that realization until much later.
Well, I think you absolutely nailed it, Peter. Right, and as you say, there's nothing wrong with saying, "Look, I'm going to build a nice practice.
Yeah,
I'm going to gradually increase my fees. I'm going to do
sure.
X number of speeches a year." To be honest with you, Peter, there's days when I yearn for that, right? Because it was simpler in so many ways, right? And now when you're running an organization, or more importantly, when you're the thought leader for an organization, there's a lot that rides on you,
Yes.
right? In terms of your ability to continue to generate ideas, continue to generate business. So there's a little bit of nostalgia for me for a simpler life, if you will, sometimes.
Right.
But the flip side is there's enormous, satisfaction in seeing an organization take root, grow, become excellent at what it does, deliver superior value for the organization, extend the reach of your ideas, become a platform for you to do other interesting things with. I mean, it's incredibly rewarding, right? But it's not obvious how you do that, right? Which again, I think is why the sort of work you do is so important, because I consider myself somewhat fortunate that I was able to sort of navigate this transition to running a consulting company. And I won't tell you it was interesting. It was easy.
Sure. Well, and for most folks, if we were to document what does it take, what are the attributes and capabilities of a great academic? What are the attributes and the capabilities of a great workshop facilitator? What are the attributes and capabilities of a managing partner of a consulting firm? The crossover is very small,
Yes.
right? So that's why people struggle with this, because you can unfortunately, I've seen some amazingly mind blowing content that never sees the light of day because people don't have the business savvy or the business acumen or whatever the case may be. Because running a consulting firm is not easy. You have to deal with things like clients and deliverables and receivables and having the right balance of bench and billability, and like those are not the metrics that we're looking at when we're doing some cool research on a book. So I think it's unusual for someone to be able to thread the needle on all of those.
It is. And, I think I feel like I got pretty lucky, but even then there were ups and downs, right? I mean, we had our highs, we had our lows. And,
Sure.
Today I'm fortunate to have a CEO who is immensely capable and experienced in running these kinds of businesses, right? And so, he is my absolute partner in every sense of the word. And he has someone like him frees someone like me to do the thought leadership work, the client development work, the strategic delivery work. That really is what a thought leader in a business like this should be doing. But, I won't claim that I had a brilliant plan for doing this. And I was very fortunate, his name is Rich Wetzler, to be able to build this partnership with Rich because he's just so capable in those areas.
So let me ask you this. So I don't know Rich, right? Most people, when they're authors or thought leaders, when they think of a partner, they want someone like them. They want a writing partner. They want someone that they can bounce ideas off of, that's creative or whatever. And it's often what they need the least.
Yep.
So, just like, are you and Rich opposites, or where do you guys overlap? So I want to understand the partnership.
No, we're very much opposites and therefore very complementary, right? I mean, he came up through, consulting firms initially as finance and then a CFO person and then into a chief operating officer and doing lots of deals and growing businesses like these businesses. And he's very connected in the industry. He's just a really capable operating and strategic executive, which I can make a shot at doing those things. I'm okay at organizing things, but it's not my true talent by any means.
Sure.
And so, no, Rich and I are really different people, but together we're a absolutely great team. And I think to your point, you've got to understand that you probably need people who are quite different than you if you're going to run a business like this, right? I mean,
exactly.
I collaborate with people lots, right? Around, I just had a paper, a new article in the brand new Harvard Business Review on how insider CEOs, can be more effective in making that transition. And I did it jointly with the chairman of a big executive search company, right? So those are very valuable writing partnerships, but it's not the core of what it takes to do what you're describing, right? Which is create an organization, scale a business, the sorts of things that you do.
I love it. So as we're wrapping up now, any final thoughts to, let me just, I would be remiss if I didn't take advantage of the 90 days, but someone who might be in their first 90 days as an author or thought leader.
Yeah, well, I mean, the foundation to me, Peter, always is the ideas, right? You need powerful ideas. And so whether you do the route A that you described, which is go in and do that research, and come to the market with something just astonishing, or you go through the process I did of finding, lead users and prototyping and refining, you've got to get that diamond because the diamond is the basis for everything that happens thereafter.
Yep.
Right. And I think, and then once you've got the diamond, you've got to make the second set of choices you alluded to, right? Which is, just going to kind of be, Peter Incorporated, or am I going to try and build something? And if I'm going to go down the road of building something, where do I get the help I need to do that?
Exactly.
Right. Where do I find the support, the advice, to create something? Because that's not necessarily going to be something that comes naturally.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I've been a fan for a long time. It was great to get sort of the behind the scenes story. So thank you so much.
Great to be able to join you, Peter. Thank you.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.